All right, guys, so now we're moving on to something a little different. This is responsive layout grids. Now, responsive layout grids are something I wish I'd learned a lot sooner in the design process. They are super, super helpful for multiple reasons, but there are two that I put above all else. One, they help things look clean and organized. They provide enough white space. They help keep things responsive. And two, they keep things very, very consistent throughout your designs. And I'll show you what I mean a little bit more by this as we dive into this. But grids are probably one of my favorite tools that you can access in Figma and Sketch and XD. They just make my life so much easier. So I really hope you guys try playing around with these. They are awesome. So let's move on to grids. So we're in our grid section here. Before we do too much, I want to dive a little bit into what grids are. You know, I can just spit it out, but we're going to take a look at some things. One of the first things I want to look at is actually in the Material UI design system for Google. They use Material UI, and there are plenty of other design systems you can go into and look at these. This is the way that Google sets up their responsive grid system, and I really like it for a lot of the things I do. So we're just going to look at this one today, but I highly encourage you to look at some others as well. So if you want to take a closer look at this, you can go to material.io. They've got their entire design system on there that you can check out. You just come down here to layout and go into responsive grid layout, or responsive layout grid, sorry. I can't read. So you'll see a couple of different things. We've got margins, gutters, columns. Those are the big three when it comes to using this type of responsive grid. Now, a little bit of a preface. When you first make a grid, and let's do this for desktop just so we're able to see a little bit more. That's zoomed in a little bit, isn't it? So when you first make a grid, you come over here to layout grid and you just have to turn it on. The thing it's going to do is it's going to pull up exactly that, a big grid. And I've got mine set to 8 pixel, which basically says each of these lines is 8 pixels wide. That's not what we're playing with right now. We're going to play more with what we saw in Material with those columns and gutters and margins. So I'm going to just click on the little grid icon right here, and I'm going to change this from grid to columns. So we will play around with that a little bit more, but that's how you get to where we're at. Now going back into Material UI, we are going to take a look at what some of these things do. So if we take a look, again, we've got columns, gutters, margins. A little breakdown as we go down here. Columns, obviously, are these big, thick, pink columns that we have here. We've got 4 of them. Don't worry about the DP right now. That's something a little more advanced we'll get into when we get more into Android and material design. But for now, just focus on those 4 columns. Basically, this is saying is we're going to split your design into 4 sections, right? And it doesn't have to be 4. I use 4 for mobile most of the time, which is what we're seeing here. There's also 8 column grids, etc. Very common ones that you will use are 8 and 12. 12 is, it really depends on what you're making. I know 12 is kind of a very common one though. So what are the gutters? Gutters are these little spaces in between. If you look up here, you've got these little spaces in between each of these columns. I like to keep mine around base 8, which means I'm going to do spaces of 8, 16. Sometimes I'll do base 4, but that's something to play around with as well. And if you read into the deep context of what we've got going on here, Material does something very similar. You can see they use 16 DP gutters, which again, we won't go into DP, but just consider that pixels for now. That's dense or pixel density related things. So if we come over to a tablet, you know, we can see they use 24 for the gutters. Something to play around with. Find what suits you based on your research and what your users need. Then we have margins. Margins are those spots on the edge of your grid. So we come back up here. Gutters are what are in between. Margins are the spacing we have on the sides. So if you think of, my favorite example to give is a mobile phone. If you are looking at your cell phone, why do we want to have this space, this margin on the edge? Every phone is different. Some have a little bit of curvature to them that might cut something off. Some have, you know, different screen sizes that can complicate things. But the easiest way I think of it is, you know, if let me pull up my phone here, for example, actually. I've got this phone case on here, very simple phone case. And you can see it's got this little bit that kind of overlaps on top of my screen. So if you have a user that's got this phone case, you don't want them to have the case covering up part of your design. So you want to throw in a little bit of margin to give yourself a little buffer room so that people can still see everything you're doing. So that's kind of basics of how these column grids are laid out. We won't go a ton into all the math behind how all of these work. Again, I highly recommend you come into Material and into other design systems and read the documentation on why they set theirs up the way they do to give you an idea of how you can do yours, and do some research, obviously, based on your project at the time to see what's best for your design system. One thing I will say, and this is true about design systems in general, the way we've been setting this up is kind of for a single project. We're not going super in depth. There's things we're leaving out, like documentation and vision documents and things like that. But if you are working for a company that plans on making multiple products, it's a good idea to keep those products in mind as well. Maybe not solely focused on those, but the design system you're setting up very often is going to be a multi-project system. For example, you know, we have Material UI here. Google has so many different products, right? But they use the same design system, these same standards across all of their designs to be consistent, to kind of give themselves a brand, which is what you want to do when you make a real professional design system. So keep that in mind. You don't want to build something that's unique to just this product that's not going to work for 95% of your other products if you can help it. So we're going to hop back over into Figma. Actually, for an example, this just gives you a couple examples of where grids might be used. You know, you've got that gutter space in between all of these cards. These cards are laid on top of those columns. And you've got that little bit of margin space on the side as well. And this is all customizable, obviously. I'll show you how to do that in Figma. And it's very similar in Sketch as well. So this is kind of our default. When I turned that grid on, it gave me 5 columns. Those are pretty big. I'm not I want a little more room to play. And you'll understand how that all works when we start throwing something on here. But going off of Material and other common themes, I am going to change this from a 5-column grid to a 12-column grid. It's kind of a safe number to play with. And we could do 8, but we're just going to do 12 for now. I want a little bit of margin there too. I don't want my designs going straight to the edge of the screen. So again, I like to do base 8. I'm going to say, let's see how 24 looks. That's not bad. Let's go with 24. Or maybe we could even bump it up to 36 if we want. Yeah, we'll do 36. Again, base 8, so increments of 8, sometimes 4. And then our gutter, it's set at 20 right now. Again, I want to do base 8, so maybe I'll change that to 16. Everything's base 8. That helps keep things consistent throughout the entire design if you have base set to one numerical value. I don't want some things to be base 8, some things base 10, some things base 12. Things are going to get messy. So decide what you want to go with and start from there. So where are these columns helpful? These columns are amazing when it comes to responsive layouts and keeping things consistent and clean through your designs. We saw some examples with those cards. So let's do something kind of like those cards. So let's say and I'm going to make this over here at first just to show you how these grids are helpful in this sense. So let's say I make a card, and I'm just going to throw out some random size right now. When you have these grids turned on, your objects are automatically going to snap to a line. What I mean by a line is you've got these edges of your columns. Each of those is one of those lines, right? So if I was to bring in this card thing that I'm making, you'll notice it'll kind of jump to that nearest line, and it'll automatically tell me you're on that line. It makes it very easy to line up with your columns. So I'm going to throw this, let's just say we'll use the whole space for now. I'm going to throw this one right there. Now, grids are not hard, fast rules. I potentially could hang off the edge here and part way into this other column if I wanted to. But for now, I'm just going to say, let's take up a full 3 columns so it's a nice, even space. Why do I want it to be even? Well, maybe I've got more of these cards, right? maybe I've got 4 of them and I want to space them evenly across my entire system. Now I know that these have equal spacing in between because they have that 16 pixel gutter in between each of them. They're all the exact same width, 3 columns, and they're going to have equal margin size on both sides. Consistency. Now, if I was to have 30 other screens where I might play with cards in 4 or 5 of those, I can follow some of these same principles to make sure I'm laying out my cards in similar ways. Now, a quick pause. I know I'm talking really fast. I'm going to slow down a little bit, go into kind of why this is important. I talk a lot about consistency in designing. Consistency in colors, typography, shapes, buttons, grids. We're making these styles. Why does consistency matter? Several reasons, one of which is ease of use, ease of designing. You know, it's much easier to use the same tools over and over again and be consistent than make something up over every 5 screens. You have to make up a new item and try to make it look somewhat similar. The other thing, and this has kind of become a focus of mine the last little bit here, is cognitive load. You know, cognitive load is the amount of information that is on someone's brain, the amount that their brain has to process and has to do. The more input that that person gets, the higher their cognitive load becomes. And as we all know, at some point, there becomes so much on your mind, or your brain is doing so much that you get stressed out, you get frustrated, you quit an application, you just hate it, and you're never going to go back and touch it again because you had a bad experience with that product. You know, the same can be said not just digitally, but across anything. Maybe you are living on a budget, right? And you're trying to budget out everything that you're spending money on. You've got your rent, you've got utilities, you've got food, you've got auto, you've got insurance, you've got all these different things. They start to build up. And each one of those bills adds to your cognitive load as well as your financial load. And eventually, you know, if you keep piling on bills, your financial load, you're going to break that budget and things are going to go south. The same happens in your mind. The more you pile on, you get closer to that breaking point where things just do not work out. Consistency helps us avoid pushing that breaking point on someone's cognitive load. How? Every time you introduce something new, you're introducing new data or new stimulus. That's new sensory input that person has to take in. Every time I introduce a new shape, say maybe I have this card, this person's going to start recognizing this as a card because they've taken that into their mind. They've processed what it is. That's on their brain. Now they know, okay, that's a card. Maybe I introduce a color scheme. You know, red means stop, green means go. They might not think about it all the time, but it's on their mind. It's in the memory banks. That adds a little more to their cognitive load. Anytime I can be consistent and remove additional variables or additional sensory input that I do not need is going to be beneficial. An example, if I have my set color palette, I'm not going to deviate from these colors. The user can get used to those colors, know this means this means this. If you were at a stoplight, you know green means go, yellow means slow down or clear the intersection, red means stop. But what if one day someone threw in purple? Just on one random stoplight, someone throws in purple. It doesn't fit the mental model that you have for that stoplight anymore. You're going to get confused, you're going to get maybe frustrated, and your cognitive load is going to jump way up because that's new sensory information that you didn't need, you didn't have before, and it just causes problems. So we want to be consistent across our designs, right? So that's why we do this. That's why we have a design system. That's why we set up grids. That's why we set up, you know, text scales and typography styles and color styles and a color palette. That's why we do all of this. Consistency. Okay, I'm done with my spiel. Let's get back into grids. So let's say I've got my cards here. Maybe I want 3 cards on another row. I'm not going to use 4, I'm just going to use 3. I can set this up in a very similar way. Sorry about that, guys. I had to pause the recording. Somebody walked in. So back to this. If I have 3 cards, you know, maybe 3 is a little more complicated because I'm not lining up with those grids anymore. And Again, grids are not a hard, fast rule. You have to use every single thing on them every single time, but it's a good idea to try. So maybe what I'll do is I'll increase my spacing a little bit. You know, I've got this one centered, and centered, there's a few more exceptions. You know, if I've got a title that's centered in the middle, maybe I don't want to increase the size of my box, but I want it centered. It might not touch those margins exactly, but that doesn't mean the things around it can't. So maybe I'll bump this over to the edge of that gutter, or that column, and I'll bump this one over to the edge of that column. Again, these are evenly spaced out, 58 pixels apart, and we can play with that a little more. We can bump them to the edges of these columns if we wanted to, which I think I might do just because. Again, it's not the exact same as what we had up here, but we don't want it to be. There's 3, not 4. We don't want the same spacing as up here. We want something a little different, something unique. But by using these columns and these grids, or this grid system, we've ensured we have equal spacing. We're centered in the middle, but we have some sort of style regulation going on the sides here. And maybe I'll bump these over to match up here. I don't know. But we can play around with it. We can have different layouts. You know, we've got 12 columns here. There's a lot of places we could put things, but we're going to be consistent throughout our design. You know, maybe every time I've got 3 cards, I'm going to line them up on these columns. Every time I've got 4 cards in my design, I'll line them up on these columns. Every time I have a button, it might be lined up on these columns or these columns. There's a lot of things you can do, and there's so many options, but you can stay consistent throughout your designs. So let's say this is the grid size I decide to go with. Now, again, I said if I was doing mobile, I would probably go with 4 columns, right? But in this instance, let's say this is what I decided to go with. This is working for me. I like the way everything's laying out. What I can do, if you got your artboard selected, you can come back over here, and again, you'll see in layout grid, we have those 12, we have those 4 dots, the extra options button. So I'm going to click on that. Look, grid styles. We can save a grid style to our Figma file. I'm going to hit add, and I'm just going to call this 12 column grid. Awesome. Now, if I come and I make another artboard over here, it helps if you do the same size artboard. So I hope I did. I did. That's awesome. So if I come into my new artboard and I want to add a grid, I could just click add grid, but that's kind of a pain because I have to go through and reset things. Or I can go to those 4 dots and I can select my 12 column grid. Again, I'm being consistent through every screen of my design, maybe every screen of all my designs and all my different projects. So that's kind of how grids work. They're very similar in the sense of you can plug them into Figma and be saved through all of your work. Very similar to, you know, text styles and color styles. We're getting close, guys. We're almost to the end of the series. We've got our color palettes and styles, our typography styles and scales. We've got our grids. Now we're going to go into components, namely master components. We're going to go over a few ways, there are many, but we're going to go over a few ways that you can utilize components efficiently and effectively throughout your designs. So I will see you guys in the next video. Take a break, go get a snack, get a drink, come back, and we'll go over components.